Thank you for joining us for this evening's conversations at the Newberry program, A Simple Cotton Sack, a conversation about African-American women, trauma, and resistance with Professors Tiya Miles and Megan Sweeney. The Conversations at the Newberry series, now in its 11th year, is generously supported by Sue and Melvin Gray. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in our reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. In all Newberry activities, we strive to bring together communities of scholars, students, and the public to discuss ideas that matter in our world today. The Newberry reading rooms and exhibition galleries are free and open to visitors every Tuesday through Saturday. Visit newberry.org to learn more about our collections and exhibitions, our many digital resources, online classes, and our virtual and in-person public programs. I also encourage you to follow the Newberry on social media for more opportunities to engage with our collections, our staff, and stories that bridge the past and the present. During this evening's program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you're joining us on Facebook or YouTube, and our speakers will take some questions near the end of the hour. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Tiya Miles is Professor of History at Harvard University, Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and Director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard. Her many awards include a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 2011 and fellowships at the Newberry Library in 1998 and 2001. She's a public historian, academic historian, and creative writer whose many books explore the intersections of African American, Native American, and women's histories. Her latest book is All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, which recently won the 2021 National Book Award for Nonfiction. This is a revelatory book that digs deeply into material culture while asking enduring questions about enslavement and freedom, family, and love. Professor Miles sought to answer many questions in All That She Carried. Questions about Ashley Sack at the center of the book. As she writes, what is the story of this cloth? Who were the mothers and daughters that touched it? And enduring questions, again in her words, what can Black women's creative response to the worst of circumstances teach us about the past and offer us for the future? I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Miles back to the Newberry today virtually to address some of these questions. Megan Sweeney is the Arthur F. Thurno Associate Professor of English, Afro-American, and African Studies and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Michigan. Her publications include the award-winning book, Reading is My Window, Books and the Art of Reading in Women's Prisons, and an edited collection, The Story Within Us, Women Prisoners Reflect on Reading. Professor Sweeney's writing has been supported by fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the Institute for Humanities at the University of Michigan, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Her next book, a collection of lyric essays called Mendings, will be published by Duke University Press tentatively in spring 2023. Professor Sweeney was kind enough to share this work in progress, which is deeply moving and challenging. As she explains, rooted in cloth and clothing, Mendings is at once a narrative about family, selfhood, and the love and loss lodged in garments, and a meditation on daily material practices for making meanings out of brokenness and grief. Sweeney brings her own past to bear in this book, drawing on her time, again in her words, as a social worker, as a seamstress in a king-size men's clothing factory, as a quilter in an African-American cultural arts center in rural Mississippi, as a teacher in bilingual elementary schools on the border of Mexico and in New York City, and as a researcher in women's prisons. I'm happy to welcome Professor Sweeney to this evening's conversations at the Newberry program. One of the reasons we brought Tiya Miles and Meg Sweeney together this evening is that their work resonates with each other in such deep and intentional ways. So we're going to start this program tonight by asking each of them to discuss their latest or ongoing works and to give a brief reading that demonstrates these intersections. And then we'll look forward to their conversations about these intersections. Let me thank you both again, Professor Miles and Professor Sweeney, for joining us tonight for this Newberry program. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tiya Miles first. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Danny, for such a warm and wonderful introduction to my work, to my new book, and to Meg's work and her forthcoming book. I am so pleased that you mentioned my Newbery Fellowships in the past, because I can't resist saying how important this space has been for me in my work. It was actually at the Newbery Library many years ago when I was on a fellowship in the summer and I was still a PhD student that I found the document that would be the central record of my dissertation and the key piece of information that structured my first book, which is called Ties That Bind, and which focused on the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in the context of slavery. So Danny, thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. And thank you for opening the doors of the Newbery Library to so many people. It's just an incredibly rich place. My new book is titled All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake. And this is a project that I had been working on for approximately 5 or 6 years. It came out in June of 21. It is coming out in paperback this very week. And it is the study of a sack, the cotton sack that accompanied the flyer for this event. The project started with that material object, and through research and conversation and walking the land, the project opened up into a study of African American women, and particularly the women of a single family who packed this sack with essential items and then passed the sack down across the generations until finally a descendant embroidered the sack with the story of these women's lives, and particularly with the story of the moment when the mother of this family, Rose, was separated from her little 9-year-old girl, Ashley. And she gave Ashley a sack that was full of the things that Rose thought Ashley would need to survive the next weeks, months, years of their separation. So in the book, one of the things that I attempt to do is to take the items that Rose packed into the sack and to contextualize them, to analyze them, to interpret them, to open up a broader story, many stories about Black women's lives, about African-American enslavement, African-American resistance and resilience, and women's lives in relation to fabrics. What I'd like to do right now in my brief reading is to read a section which is very connective with Megan Sweeney's work. It's a section that comes from my chapter 4 titled Rose's Inventory, and it discusses the dress that Rose packed into the sack for Ashley. The torn dress Rose possessed and then gave to her daughter was probably made of coarse cotton or the linen woolen blend characteristic of Negro cloth. If Rose was hired out by her owners and permitted to retain a fraction of her income, she may have had the chance to purchase the fabric she favored. It is a guess more than fair, given the proficiency of enslaved women with the needle, that Rose sewed this garment for herself years before that fateful winter. Perhaps she had worn it over time, imparting to it a singular scent that only her child might recognize. And maybe there was another significance interwoven into the cloth that Rose was determined to pass down. We know from the stories of enslaved women that special items of apparel were not acquired without sacrifice. A tattered dress is 1,000 things, my friend who sews her own wardrobe told me when I shared the word stitched onto the sack with her. I think we sense this to be true of our own age dresses that morph into many meanings and memories of intimate ties. a hope of happiness for the grandchild who marries in the same satin gown, a parent's loving look of pride frozen into a pink tulle tutu, a slave mother's final embrace, arms outstretched, then empty. This dress belonging first to Rose and then to Ashley, a fabric scar, a second skin, a shield, was a sign of women's lives frayed by slavery, but nevertheless resplendent with beauty. And so I will stop there and pass it over to Megan.
So I want to start by saying also thank you to Danny for convening this event, and to Tiya for being such an important friend and such an inspiring and gorgeous writer and thinker. It's such an honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you. So I'll start by saying a little bit about the book Mendings, which, as Danny mentioned, is coming out with Duke in 2023. It's composed of 5 interconnected essays, all of which engage with themes of cloth and clothing and explore practices of making meaning out of brokenness and grief. The first half of the book centers my parents, both of whom have passed away, and I write about my complex entanglement with my mother, my loss-filled relationship with my father, and my long-term attachment to clothing as a lifeline and tool for mending. In the second half of the book, I explore clothing and mending through broader lenses, touching on subjects such as American practices of enslavement and incarceration, discourses about hoodies, and environmental and labor issues related to clothing. I ask, in a country that has routinely used clothing to dehumanize and dispossess, to subordinate and sever connections, how have individuals and communities used clothing as a means to mend from violence, injustice, and loss? In dialogue with historians such as Tiya, environmentalists, evolutionary biologists, fiber artists, and clothing lovers, I reflect on the relationship between dress and redress, the difference between mending and fixing, and the never-ending ways in which mending can alter our relationships with ourselves and others, both living and deceased. I also explore questions such as, how do we make sense of fragments that will never add up to a whole? What is the alchemy for converting scarcity and need into artistry and passion? What roles do beauty and adornment play in the midst of violence, constraint, and devastation? And how might individual efforts to mend compete with or complement collective forms of mending? I'd like to read 2 brief passages inspired by my conversations with Tiya and by Tiya's gorgeous book. The first passage concludes a meditation on clothing and archives. The constancy of the human presence that permeates every surface. This is the poetry we are seeking, writes Pablo Neruda. In a tattered dress or faded apron, I'm seeking the poetry of menders' tender touchings permeating forgotten fabric. In the permeated impurity of clothes, I am seeking all that unwritten stories of dress and redress might teach me. I'm seeking the constancy of poetry, born of the constancy of violence absorbed by cloth. In discarded sweat-stained garments, I'm seeking the human presence of makers, dressers, wearers, washers, and menders whose efforts to find sustenance in an unbearable present endure in the fibers they once touched. If cloth is a means of incorporation, a time-honored way to bring humans into networks of care, obligation, and belonging, I'm seeking to reincorporate those whose dignity, desires, and needs have been witnessed by garments, but disavowed by fellow humans. In cloths and clothes that never find their way to museums, I'm seeking the resilience of the tattered, the persistence of the faded, the reminder of the remainder, the poetry of mending. Can I get a witness? The second passage comes at the very end of my book, and it's in direct dialogue with a question that Tiya asked me. What do you call the space between the stitches? I think my mending is finished, but then it happens, a loud rending or barely perceptible tear. So I summon my needle and thread, ready to incorporate traces of repair into the overall design. A slight irregularity of texture, a thread color that differs from the original, a faint fading where a hemline used to be, a crease that no amount of ironing can erase. Sometimes loss blossoms into lace as tiny rays of light escape from the line of reconnected fibers, reminding me of the intricate beauty of designs wrought from accretions of mending. Inhabiting the non-pastness of the past, I embrace the work of repair, knowing that the sleeve will tear again. A mitten will never have its mate. A broken relationship will never be made whole. There are really two environments governing the evolution of sentient creatures, writes Faris Jabbar, an external one which they inhabit, and an internal one which they construct. Mending sits at the intersection of these worlds. Making do with the pieces we've been given, we sentient creatures sort and salvage, supplement and discard, incorporating old and new selves as we intertwine with other menders, would-be menders, and a world in dire need of mending. The work is never finished. Indeed, living is my name for the space between the stitches. So Tiya, I would love to start us off with more of a reflection than a question. I love and feel so moved in your work by your really layered attention to materiality. And if you'll indulge me, I just want to dwell on that aspect of your work for a few minutes. Because textiles are vulnerable to deterioration, and it's often difficult to name a particular maker, you say that historians are less likely to turn to fabric to understand the past. But you underscore the immeasurable value of material culture for understanding histories of the marginalized, and the crucial roles that material objects such as clothing play for defending enslaved people's dignity as humans and as women. You emphasize that for enslaved people, cherished things could be companions, soften daily routine, reinforce a sense of self-worth, and strengthen communal ties. You note that attention to material things can help us access intangible feelings and desires that evade the record. You talk about Elizabeth Keckley writing a letter to her mother, asking for a dress. And you write that given that she was enduring sexual violence by her master, surely she was seeking a deeper kind of cover when she was asking for that dress. You write about an enslaved woman named Winnie Martin who found a way to deliver blue glass beads to her son who had been sold to another master. And you talk about that as an ingenious and courageous way for Winnie to comfort her son, remind him of her love and of their family connection. And you also remind us as your readers of the undeniable physicality of the coarse cloth that was manufactured specifically for unfree people to wear, and of the auction block, which you describe as worn smooth by the press of bare, stolen feet. I wanted to bring these examples to the table just to emphasize how much these concrete reminders are essential for reckoning with our history. And I just want to offer one more quick reflection. I was struck in your essay on process at the end of your book, when you write that your attention to material things is inspired by environmental understandings, that everything that we can trace about human existence derives in some way from natural and material sources. And I was thinking in particular that it's useful to think of materiality as an environmental understanding when it comes to cloth and clothing, because they carry crucial traces of our individual and communal lives, but cloth and clothing also leave material traces in our air and water and food, and causing damage to animals and plants and ourselves, also participating in exploitative labor practices. So I was thinking about materiality as an environmental approach, that it underscores the really profound extent to which our textiles and our fates as humans are interconnected. So I'll stop there, but just wanted to say how much I love the idea of materiality as environmental in your work.
Oh, Meg, thank you for all of that. And thank you for introducing your forthcoming book to us, for reading those gorgeous passages, and for taking us into a conversation about materiality in such a nuanced, complex way. I'm not even sure where to begin. So I think that I will actually take a couple of steps back, because I want those who are here with us this evening to kind of see and to feel that we're all now in a conversation together that you and I started many years ago. We've been talking about these questions of materiality, of clothing, of emotion, of expression for quite some time. And each time we talk, I feel that another facet of the topic opens up before me, and I grasp it in a different and a new, very illuminating way. So when you read from Mendings right now and talked about the process of turning loss into lace, that captured me. That just captured me, Meg. And I've read those lines before. I've had the privilege of reading your manuscript that's going to be out next year. But hearing you say those words brought them to the fore of my mind so clearly, and helped me to think about how I feel that is really what we're talking about when we get into a discussion of materiality, material things and objects, and what they do for us in our lives, what they do for us in our ability to think about the meaning of our lives. Because loss, such a difficult emotion that we have all felt in different ways. Certainly an emotion that the enslaved women in my book felt unceasingly, is nevertheless difficult to express, to kind of get our minds around. The loss can feel like this gut-wrenching hole in a person's experience and in a person's life. And when you mentioned the notion of turning loss into lace, you concretized that emotion. You gave that emotion a form. You gave it a beautiful form where we can imagine that something is there, because lace is there, but it's shot through with so many holes and fissures, and there are light spaces and dark spaces. It creates a pattern. That's the way loss is. And that's what loss does. And you were able to capture that, to convey that by bringing in the comparison with a material object. And that's been my experience of working with the sack for this book, with Ashley Sack, and with thinking about the things that Rose packed into the sack, which included the tattered dress, pecans, a braid from Rose's own hair, and also the emotion love, a totally different kind of thing. And in trying to think about these different material objects, I found myself coming closer, I think, I hope, I do believe, coming closer to the experiences of enslaved women than I ever have before. And it has something to do with the solidity of the material, the way in which loss turned into lace when you were speaking to us, reading from your forthcoming book. The tangibility of objects, I think, it helps us to think in different ways. It helps us to kind of attach and hold on. It helps us to hold a thought. It helps us to hang on to an emotion and kind of put it before us and to see it and to move it in the light and see it from different angles. And so for me, having to contend with a sack at the center of this work was at first incredibly challenging for the reasons that you have said. There is not concrete evidence about the sack in terms of who manufactured it, when it was manufactured, and how it came into Rose's hands. Those aren't the kinds of topics that we tend to have records about. And so it was very challenging. And yet, once I started to work on it, I was pulled into it in a way that I have never been pulled into a document. The sack became almost like a bridge to the past because of its tangibility. Because I knew, because we all know, that that sack existed in the 1800s. It existed in the 1850s. It was held by Rose. It was held by Ashley. It was held by their descendant Ruth. And we could hold it now. We could touch it. And something incredibly connected and relational about that things can do. I also felt that working with material objects and thinking about materiality in this research, it compelled me to consider everyday life in a different kind of way. It compelled me to think about everyday life in a minute by minute kind of way. It forced me to think about Rose as a person wearing certain garments, probably with her hair tied back, using her hands as she scooped up the pecans that she put into the sack for Ashley. And that kind of thinking becomes very focused and even intimate in a different kind of way. So all of that happens, I think, when we begin to closely consider material objects. And the point that you brought out from the essay at the end of my book having to do with environmental history, environmental studies and objects is one that is not a brand new, but a fairly recent development in environmental history, which is a subfield that I'm fascinated by and dedicated to, even though I don't consider myself to be an expert in it. And it's an area of inquiry that wants us to realize that, of course, everything around us comes from the environment. Every single thing comes from the environment. There's no separation between our daily lives, the things that we need to live those lives, and the world around us. And so we are therefore deeply connected to our environment, intimately tied to our environment, and that can have positive implications. And it can also have negative implications in terms of the ways in which we, as a species, have been degrading our environment. So I could keep talking about materiality, and I'm noticing the time. So what I would really love to do is to turn this question back to you and ask you about Mendings, because I remember so many things being described in your forthcoming book. You know, buttons and drawings and keepsakes in a box. How did you contend with the material as you were writing memoir?
So I think one of the reasons I'm so moved by your work is how much it resonates with me that material objects can tell us so much about how we make meaning and so much about how we try to exercise agency amid constraints. And that was something that was in my mind throughout writing Mendings. The archive that I gathered allowed me to discover things about people I'd known all my life. So things like my mother writing a newspaper column in high school, hearing her voice at that age. I found a scrapbook that my dad's mother had created when she was a young woman. There were seed catalogs from my mom, notes of the work that she had done as a docent, cards that she and my dad exchanged. And all of these things brought my parents to life in vibrant and healthy and agentic periods. I was also interacting with and recontextualizing my own letters and journals and drawings and clothes from my childhood. And that gave me a whole new level of understanding of what I was experiencing as a child, and a whole new appreciation for all the ways, sometimes desperate, in which I was trying to make meaning of various experiences. And those objects helped me understand that process. And I'll also say quickly that focusing on material objects has also given me new ways to think about something that Anne Anlin Cheng describes as flesh that has been objectified needs adornment as a way to come back to itself. And I was thinking about that in context of incarceration in ways that gave me whole new ways to think about the experiences of incarcerated people that barely make it into the record. And just two quick examples. In the early 20th century, Black women in the convict lease system in Georgia were forced to wear men's clothing and shoes. And some of those women burned that clothing as an act of resistance, which also cut into the profits of the lease companies. And then if we jump into the present in California, there is a forced feminization rather than defeminization, where gender non-binary people are being forced to wear women's undergarments and things like that. And in that instance, incarcerated people are making boxer shorts from sheets and things like that. So there's those two examples are separated in time, but both emphasize how clothing can become a tool for agency and resistance. And it's the materiality of those acts of burning or, sewing new undergarments that really bring that agency to life, I think.
Well, Meg, I know that you want to move us on to another topic, but I can't resist just coming in here to say that I think that it is really fascinating what you offered about the way in which material things help us to make meaning in our own lives, and how after you compiled an archive of your family's mementos, you actually saw yourself in a different way. Once you had amassed those, you saw yourself in a different way. And I think that's the same kind of process, or at least a similar process, that I saw unfolded in my research process for my book. That is, as a scholar, by looking through the lenses of material objects, I began to see the past in a different way and to make new meanings because of those things that I had arrayed, in my mind before me.
Well, so that leads actually into a question that I had wanted to ask, which has to do with your experience of writing the book. And you write in All That She Carried that the process of telling enacts change for the writer, but also for the reader or the listener. And you talk about bearing witness as one of the most effective ways to carry the past. And you write about telling as being like a form of stitching that can heal in the action of inward and outward motion and bringing loose ends together. And I was thinking as I was reading All That She Carried that you have been listener and teller and witness in the process of conjuring these gripping stories from the faintest whispers and traces. So you've said a little bit already, but I'd love to hear more of what was it like for you to receive and imagine and stitch together and bear witness to the stories enfolded in your book, and And is there more that you would want to say about how that process has affected you?
Yes, there is. Thank you for that question, Meg. That question is leading me to want to read the inscription on the sack at the center of the book, which is known as Ashley sack. The inscription is on the image of the sack that accompanied the announcement for this event. So I know that many of the people who are gathered here in this same space have seen it. But I want to read it because it's very important for building a foundation for my response to your question, Meg. This is the story that Ruth Middleton, who was the great-granddaughter of Rose, the enslaved woman I mentioned earlier, stitched, that she sewed onto the sack. So you'll all recall the sack was passed down across the generations. Ruth inherited that sack and she stitched, she embroidered this inscription onto its surface. Quote, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her, it be filled with my love always." She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. And I wanted to read that because you asked a question about telling and trauma and telling and stitching. And my thinking about those concepts and those actions and how they interrelate came directly from Ruth Middleton. Ruth Middleton was a working class, very young mother in the early 20th century, living in Philadelphia by that time because she had moved north during the first wave of the Great Migration. And she decided to stitch this traumatic story of the separation of her grandmother from her great-grandmother. She decided to tell it through stitches. And I sat with that for a very long time, weeks, months, years, and with the question of, why did Ruth choose this method? Why did she choose to sew this story down as opposed to writing the story down? Why did she even decide that she was going to record this particular story? Because surely she had others that had been passed down to her orally through her family. Why this story? I mean, why this heartbreaking story? And the more I thought about that and sat with that, I realized, first of all, Ruth Middleton was a creative, brilliant, intentional person who created so many things in this one inscription on this single sack. And I also realized that telling was perhaps her way of facing this trauma, of facing this violation of the value, the norm of kinship, of facing this violation of Black motherhood. And she did this when she was herself a new mother, Meg. As you know, she had her own daughter not very long before she did this. And so I thought about how she may have been using this process of telling as a way to begin to mend, borrowing that word from your work, to begin to mend this family line of women who had been traumatized by the things we know they suffered through slavery and the things we don't know. Because I am certain that Ruth Middleton did not tell the whole story. She could not have told the whole story in this inscription. She probably did not want to articulate the whole story, as many Black women who have been enslaved did not want to reveal the kind of violence and violation they faced. So through telling this one piece of it in this way, she may have been healing herself, I thought, and trying to pass down a legacy that embraces healing to her daughter, Dorothy. And once I realized, or thought I realized what Ruth may have been doing, that's when I started reading psychological literature about telling and trauma. That's when I started making connections between what Ruth had done and truth and reconciliation conditions. The theory of it came directly from Ruth. And as far as my own experience goes with telling the story, I feel humbled and I feel privileged to be a part of this larger process of telling the story of this family, of Rose's, Ashley's, and Ruth's family, and of African American women, of Black people, of women. It's a privilege to be a storyteller, and it is a deep responsibility. And even though I cry every single time I read that inscription, every single time, I do feel that sitting with that experience, as Ruth told it, and seeing the way she centered love is also a process of mending for me. And I hope a process of mending for anybody who engages with the story. So when I worked on this book, I was writing about people who are not in my family. I mean, they're in my cultural family, and I feel connected to them as a descendant of enslaved people myself, but this is not my family. You wrote about your family in your forthcoming book. And I think that is a whole different level of merging telling with the processing of trauma. I wonder if you would want to talk about that a little bit, Meg, about writing a personal story in relation to the question that you posed to me.
So this may sound like a strange way to begin, but when I think about the dwelling that I did with my parents, with my younger selves, with elements of our past, it felt like one of the most joyful experiences of my life, in that I am by temperament and training a close reader who loves having a chance to think and understand and make meaning and sort and arrange. And so the work of doing that, I actually felt a kind of grief at the end when I felt like I had untangled the threads. It felt like a kind of loss from that time of being able to dwell with my family and with earlier versions of myself. I can say quickly, I think I write about this in Mendings, that in terms of thinking about my mother, I came across this concept during the writing process from quantum mechanics, or quantum physics, which is entanglement. And it's this idea of paired particles that no matter how far apart they are, when you learn about one, you learn about the other. And that kind of pairing often happens from the result of a collision of particles. And that felt like such a useful way to think about what happened to me in the course of writing, which was feeling long after collision, this understanding of my mother and me as paired particles in ways that are about deep connection, though we are now separated by this galaxy of life and death. And it felt almost like falling in love again after a painful separation, to know her in new ways like that. My experience with writing about my father was different in that I thought that it would be much easier, because in some ways my emotional archive with my dad was thinner and less complicated than with my mother. So I remember thinking, oh, I can write the essay about my dad in a couple of weeks, which was ridiculous. That didn't happen at all. But what I ended up really grappling with in that writing was the idea of what do we do when the pieces can't be assembled into something like a whole? And so that gave me a whole new understanding as a mender of the kind of limits of mending, which not limits, but a new way of understanding mending as an attentiveness to the past and a commitment to make meaning from the past, rather than thinking of it as something that could eradicate loss or achieve some elusive wholeness. And so thinking about mending as embracing the holes and the threadbare patches and all the things that contribute to the design, without letting the past be like a black hole that just wrenches everything into it. So finding ways to live and breathe and reimagine with a past that can never be entirely repaired. And I feel like in so many ways, what you have done in your book is a version of that, of taking this past that is filled with the wreckage of slavery and settler colonialism, and finding what is life-sustaining and resilient and possible from that, and bringing that forward. So I think of you as having enacted a kind of mending in your work.
Thank you, Meg. I think before we open up to questions from those who are here with us, I want to take us back to something that you said early on in this conversation. You talked about how years ago, when I was trying to make sense of Ruth Middleton's inscription on the sack, I asked you, what do you call the space between the stitches? And I asked you that because you are someone who sews, you've sewn your whole life, and I'm not someone who sews very well at all. I thought there might be some technical term for this. And I want to share with you that, as you know, that question that I put to you is in the book. And I have actually received many emails from readers who are trying to help me figure out, what do you call that space between the stitches? And no one has actually found a proper word, a technical term for the space. But you have proposed that that space is actually living. It's called living. And I think that is perfect, Meg. It's perfect to think that living is the space between the stitches, because we are constantly engaged in a process of mending.
It was a question. You stumped me, but I dwelled then with that question for a long time, and so I loved the question. Speaking of which, I think that's probably a cue for us to open up for questions from the audience. We have so many more things we could talk about, Tiya, but let's hear from the audience.
Thanks so much, Tiya and Megan. We do have a number of questions from the audience. I want to start just with a factual question that came from Facebook. Megan, you were talking from a viewer on Facebook. Megan, you were talking about a period where African-American women were forced to wear men's clothing, and the viewer just wanted a little more clarification on the time period and location and the story behind that.
So I'm borrowing there from a scholar named Talitha LaFloria. She has a book called Chained in Silence, and she writes about in the early 20th century, in the and the late 19th century, in during the time of the convict lease system. That was when this was Black women in Georgia who were being forced to wear the shoes and the clothing of men who were on the convict lease system at the time. And so I learned from Talitha LaFloria's work about women performing clothing arson in that context.
Thanks for that clarification. So Sarah, viewer, asks a question. She writes, do you think also that the telling of the story in stitches is a way to put the story in the world in a way that perhaps it might reach people who caused the trauma, a way of seeing the pain, setting the pain away from oneself and providing a witness? Wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think that is a fascinating interpretation. It's one that had not entered my mind before this very moment, that to stitch, you have to hold a needle, and to hold a needle could be, well, a violent act. It could be. When you think about piercing a surface with the tip of a needle, that may be one I need to sit with for a while. I think that kind of interpretation certainly could hold for many people who had been traumatized by enslavement. I think in the case of Ruth Middleton in particular, that her stitching had more to do with her own location in a Black community in Philadelphia, which was a working class and also professional Black community. It was a Christian community. She was moving in circles of women who were meeting in clubs and who were traveling for vacation later on in her life. And so I think that for her in particular, in her context, that stitching was not meant as a punishment to an audience. But I think she did imagine an audience, certainly. I think her audience was her daughter. I think her audience was other African Americans, working people moving up into the middle classes who may have been able to see this piece of work in her home.
So this is a more personal question. I hope neither of you mind it. Jane says, this is such a special, profound conversation. Thank you both. The question is for both of you. When and how did you first feel a connection to material culture in your own lives? If you don't mind sharing, was there a specific object, and what were your thoughts on it?
I write about that in Mendings, actually. For me, I think I was barely 2 years old, and my parents had gone away and brought back a little shorts and shirt outfit. And that was a kind of traumatic time in our family in a range of ways. And I remember that was my first memory of clothing, and thinking about clothing as the return of my mother, and a sense of safety and connection. And so from a very young age, I started associating connection, I think, and particularly maternal connection with clothing and cloth.
I tell a story about an object in my family in all that she carried as well. I write about the quilt that's in the image behind me, which is a family heirloom that I inherited after my grandmother passed away. But this quilt is not my earliest memory. I think the questioner asked us about earliest memories, and what immediately came to my mind was actually an item of clothing, Meg. It was my grandmother's maid uniform. And I remember when I was a little girl, I lived with my grandmother and my granddad, my mother did too, for a time. And I remember watching my grandmother get ready for work, and she would go to her closet, she'd pull out this uniform, which to me at the time didn't looked like a uniform or like a maid's uniform. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that she would go to her closet, she would pull it out, it would be neat and pressed, she would put it on. And it wasn't until, my goodness, until I was an adult that I saw a photograph of my grandmother wearing her maid's uniform and holding my mother when my mother was a very small girl, that I realized what that item of clothing was. I'm just going to stop talking about that right there.
This is not exactly framed as a question, but I'm going to try to turn it into a question. A viewer named Barbara says that she finds the conversation fascinating. She loves that two women of different histories can talk in this way. She's an educator in the city. I assume she means Chicago. And she's asking about, I think she's asking about the audience for your books, and wondering how we can engage students, and especially students of color, in discussions like this around objects, around material culture, around family history. It's a huge question, but I think she's wondering for ways, she's looking for ways really to hook students into conversations through the kind of work that you're doing.
I can offer a quick thought and then pass it to Tiya. So I'm teaching a class right now called Threads. What does clothing have to do with race, culture, politics, and the environment? And we read the chapter about the tattered dress in the class. And we're reading a section from my forthcoming book that is about many different historical ways in which clothing has served as a means to resist violence and constraint and things like that. So because we toggle between the personal and the social and the historical and the political, it's something that is material objects. They're so concrete to students' own experience in some ways that it helps them be able to bridge into stories that are distant from their own experiences, but have a commonality in the link of cloth and clothing. I'd be happy to share that syllabus if that would be helpful.
Thanks. And Tiya, your thoughts on this, and then I think we're going to unfortunately have to leave it there.
Okay. My hoped for audience for all that she carried was a broad adult audience. I was hoping that people would be able to come to it from many different positions and places and experiences and find something in it that was meaningful for them and would open them to this history. So my book is not intended for children, though I do want to write for children, and I do have 3 children. I think when it comes to introducing students to these kinds of themes and questions, material objects can really make a world of difference, and we can find them all around, especially through visiting museums and historic sites. So I would recommend that.
Thank you so much, Tiya Miles, Megan Sweeney, for your work, for this wonderful and engaging conversation. I think for leaving us with this question of what do you call the space between the stitches. I think you both pull us into those spaces in really remarkable and thought-provoking ways. So thank you for that. Thank you for being part of this Newbery program this evening. Thanks to all of you who are here for joining us today. For those of you who started late with us, I saw there were many comments on that. A recording of this program will soon be available on the Newbery's YouTube channel. So check that out there. I want to say also that Newbery programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of donors to the library during this critical time, and at all times we need the support of our entire community. So please support the Newbery Library by making a gift today. You can do that online at newbery.org/give. And please join us for our next virtual program, part of our Colonial History Lecture Series. The program will be held on Saturday, February 12th at 10 a.m. Central Time. Historian Eric Hinderaker will present on Wars of Independence and Revolution in the Americas, 1775 to 1825. If you want to find out more about that or other Newberry programs, you can visit our website, and you can always join our mailing list so that you're the first to hear about upcoming programs and other Newberry news. You can sign up for that mailing list at newberry.org. Thank you again for joining us this evening for this Conversations at the Newberry program. Thank you to Tiya Miles, and thank you to Megan Sweeney again for such a wonderful conversation.